What happens when two Hollywood legends collide on live television, and the room suddenly shifts from laughter to an icy, breath-holding silence. Before we dive into this unforgettable moment between Sandra Bullock and Whoopi Goldberg, make sure you subscribe to Stage View, hit that like button, and comment below to fuel the stories we bring to life every day. The morning began like any other episode of The View, with its usual orchestra of chatter, laughter, and overlapping opinions. But there was something different in the air that day. Something that made even the stagehands whisper behind their clipboards, sensing a tension they couldn't quite name. The studio lights glowed a little brighter, the audience murmured with an extra buzz of anticipation, and as the theme music faded, Whoopi leaned forward in her chair with that iconic mix of warmth and mischief. Sandra Bullock entered the stage with her trademark grace, dressed in a sleek black suit that caught the light with each step. The audience erupted as she waved, smiling wide, though that smile carried something layered behind it, an exhaustion, maybe, or the emotional weight of the film she was promoting. Her new project was a raw, challenging drama about loss, forgiveness, and the fragility of public life. And she had come prepared to talk about it with honesty. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the conversation would veer off the script and take a turn neither she nor Whoopi could walk back from. "Good to have you back, Sandra," Whoopi said as the applause settled. "It's been a minute." Sandra gave a short laugh. "It has, and it feels good to be here." But even as she spoke, her eyes flickered across the table, to Sunny, to Joy, to Sarah, as if searching for something. Maybe reassurance, maybe stability, or maybe she just sensed what was coming. Whoopi wasted no time. "So let's talk about this film," she said, tapping the cue card but not actually looking at it. "It's heavy stuff. You went deep. Real deep." Sandra nodded. "I wanted to tell a story that felt real, that didn't shy away from uncomfortable truths." "Uncomfortable truths," Whoopi repeated, leaning back, folding her arms. "That's interesting." The audience chuckled lightly, sensing a tease. But the tone was off. There was an edge there, a sharpness in Whoopi's voice that hadn't been there moments earlier. Sandra's posture shifted almost imperceptibly, her foot crossing over her ankle, her shoulders tightening just a breath. She knew Whoopi well enough to hear the tone beneath the tone. "Is there something you want to say?" Sandra asked with a smile, attempting to keep things light. "Yeah," Whoopi said. "Actually, there is." The room felt suddenly smaller. The soundstage, so often filled with jubilant chaos, settled into a stillness so fragile it could have cracked beneath a whisper. Even the crew paused behind the cameras. Whoopi leaned in. "I saw you talking recently about how the movie industry treats emotional stories differently when certain people tell them." Sandra froze, not dramatically, but in the subtle way someone freezes when they realize they've stepped into a conversation they can't escape. "I did," she said quietly. "Because it's true." "Is it?" Whoopi asked, her eyebrow lifting. "Or is that just convenient?" The tension hit the audience before it hit Sandra. A ripple of shocked murmurs washed through the room. Sandra blinked once, slowly, the camera catching the tiny shift in her expression. Hurt? Or confusion? Or disbelief that Whoopi was pushing this on live television? "Convenient," Sandra repeated. "I don't say things because they're convenient. I say them because they're real." Whoopi's chair creaked as she leaned forward. "But whose reality, Sandra? Yours? Hollywood's? Because sometimes people say things about the industry without realizing they're speaking from a very specific vantage point." Sunny glanced between them, her lips parting as if to intervene, but even she hesitated. This wasn't the typical playful sparring. This was personal. Sandra inhaled, a steady, practiced breath. "Are you saying I shouldn't speak about my experiences?" "I'm saying," Whoopi replied, voice now low, steady, "that sometimes when actors talk about what's unfair, they forget they're part of the machine too." A hush swept the audience. Not a gasp, not a whisper. Just silence, the kind that stops time. Sandra's eyes darkened, not in anger, but in something deeper. "Whoopi, I've never pretended I'm not part of the machine. But I can still criticize it. I can still want it to do better." "Sure," Whoopi said. "But when you say things like certain stories get ignored because of who tells them, it sounded like you were talking about us." Sandra blinked again, this time faster. "Us? As in me. As in a lot of people who've been telling emotional stories for decades and didn't get the kind of spotlight you're saying is missing." Now the audience reacted, small gasps, murmurs, a few raised eyebrows. This wasn't subtle anymore. Sandra's voice softened. "Whoopi, that wasn't what I meant. But that's how it sounded, Whoopi countered, her gaze unwavering. The camera operators were practically holding their breath, trying to keep the shots steady. Sunny shifted in her chair, clearing her throat. Maybe we should clarify. But Whoopi held up a hand. Not dismissive, just firm. No, let her finish. Sandra swallowed. Her hands clasped together, fingers tightening. What I meant, she said slowly, is that emotion in film is often only considered prestige when it's told from certain perspectives. I wasn't talking about you. Or anyone here. Well, Whoopi said, you didn't exactly say that either. A flicker of something crossed Sandra's face. Frustration, maybe, or exhaustion, or the weight of 1,000 interviews where her intentions were twisted, reshaped, fed back to her with sharp edges. I'm sorry if it came off that way, she said. That wasn't. No, Whoopi interrupted. See, that's the thing. It didn't come off any particular way. It was vague, and vague can be dangerous, because then people fill in the blanks with whatever narrative makes sense. Joy leaned forward, gently touching the table. Whoopi, maybe we should. Whoopi shook her head. Sandra's a big girl. She can speak for herself. Sandra sat up straighter, her shoulders squaring. I can, she said, her voice firmer now. And I will. You're right, I could have been clearer. But I think you're misunderstanding me. Then clarify it, Whoopi said simply. Sandra stared at her for a moment. A long, quiet moment where the entire room seemed to lock into place. And then she spoke. What I meant, she said, voice steady, is that stories about vulnerability, grief, recovery, those stories are universal. But the industry often labels them differently depending on who's telling them. I've seen films made by women of color dismissed as too specific. I've seen stories told by white directors praised as groundbreaking for dealing with the same themes. And I'm saying it's time for that to change. The audience listened, silent and tense. Whoopi didn't speak for a moment. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she was evaluating, measuring Sandra's words, testing their weight. And you don't think your privilege plays a role in which stories get elevated? Whoopi finally asked. Sandra shook her head softly. Of course it does. I've benefited from it. I've acknowledged that. I'm not pretending I'm outside the system. I'm saying I'm trying to push it to be better. Another beat of silence. Then Whoopi leaned back, her expression unreadable. Okay, she said finally. Then say that. Say it clearly. Because the way you said it last time, that wasn't clear. Sandra exhaled, long and quiet. Fair enough. But the air hadn't cleared. Not even close. Something unspoken still hung between them, thick and pulsing, like a string pulled too tight. Sunny jumped in, attempting to break the tension. Well, this is obviously a passionate conversation. Sandra cut in gently. Sunny, it's okay. Really? She turned back to Whoopi. I respect you. I always have. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend I said something I didn't. And I'm not going to apologize for calling out a problem that exists. The audience stirred again. The energy was shifting, deepening. Whoopi nodded once. Slowly. I didn't ask you to apologize, she said. I asked you to clarify. And I did, Sandra replied. The air felt electric, charged with something that could erupt or evaporate, depending on the next breath, the next word. Whoopi's gaze softened just a fraction. Good. But Sandra wasn't finished. But you also assumed the worst of me, she said quietly. And I don't know why. That line hit harder than anything she'd said before. The audience reacted. A few gasps, a few murmurs, a startling tension that snapped through the room like static. Whoopi blinked. Once. Twice. Then she sat forward, elbows on the table. You want to know why, she said. Sandra nodded. Whoopi's voice dropped to a near whisper, low, controlled, intimate in a way that made the room lean in without meaning to. Because sometimes, she said, people say things that sound progressive, things that sound supportive, and they don't realize the impact they have on people who've lived a different reality. Sandra listened, unblinking. And sometimes, Whoopi continued, those words hit harder coming from someone who's never had to fight for her story to be seen. The silence that followed was seismic. A silence that felt like the breath before a storm. Sandra drew in a slow breath. You think I haven't fought? I think you haven't had to fight in the same way, Whoopi replied. The studio audience was frozen, their faces mirroring the tension vibrating across the table. A woman in the front row clutched her purse. Another covered her mouth. Sandra leaned forward, her voice steady but edged with raw truth. Maybe not, but that doesn't make my advocacy empty. And it doesn't make my experience invalid. The room stirred again. The tension wasn't breaking. It was escalating. Sandra and Whoopi, two titans of their craft, locked eyes in a moment so charged that even Joy, Sunny, and Sarah seemed unsure whether to intervene or simply witness. And then, just when it felt like the air couldn't hold another ounce of pressure, the floor manager signaled. 5 seconds to commercial. Whoopi didn't look away from Sandra. Sandra didn't flinch. The audience didn't breathe. And the screen faded to black. The commercial break was supposed to reset the room, but instead it only deepened the tension. Crew members darted around the set with forced efficiency, pretending not to notice the silence radiating from the table like heat from an open flame. The makeup artist approached Sandra with a quiet, nervous smile, dabbing lightly at her cheek, though her hand trembled ever so slightly. Someone offered Whoopi a bottle of water. She waved it away, her eyes still fixed on the table, jaw set. Neither woman spoke. Neither moved. It was as though the confrontation still lingered in the air, suspended, waiting for the cameras to return so it could resume its full form. Sunny whispered something to Joy, who raised her eyebrows, bit her lip, and glanced in Sandra's direction. Sarah simply stared at the cue cards she wasn't reading, her face pale with the sinking realization that she was witnessing a moment the internet would dissect for years. 30 seconds, the floor manager called. Sandra exhaled, slow and controlled. She pressed her hands together on her lap, rubbing her thumb across the side of her finger. A small, grounding gesture she'd learned from years of navigating public scrutiny. She wasn't angry. Not yet. But she was shaken, and the tremor beneath her calm exterior was something only someone who truly knew her could detect. Whoopi leaned back, crossing her arms. Her expression was unreadable, but her silence said enough. She wasn't done. The audience murmured among themselves. They had witnessed The View go off-script before, fiery debates, heated discussions. But this was something different. Raw, personal. A moment where two icons had peeled back their professional layers without meaning to. 10 seconds. Sandra straightened her blazer. Whoopi finally looked away from the table and toward the cameras, her face smoothing into that familiar, authoritative composure viewers around the world recognized. 5, 4, 3. The theme music faded back in, and the show returned. Whoopi plastered on a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. Welcome back. Sandra sat poised, her expression neutral, betraying nothing. Sunny decided to seize the reins before the conversation spiraled again. Sandra, your film tackles grief in a way we haven't quite seen from you before. What pulled you toward such a heavy narrative? Sandra nodded gently, grateful for the redirect. I think grief is something everyone carries, she said, even if we don't talk about it. And sometimes the loneliest part of grief is feeling like your experience is illegitimate or invisible. The audience quieted, drawn in by her sincerity. But grief doesn't care about status or success or what the world thinks you should feel, Sandra continued. It hits us all the same. I wanted to portray that honestly. Her voice was soft, vulnerable, a deliberate attempt to pull the conversation back to neutral ground. But Whoopi wasn't finished. That's true, she said slowly. But there's also the grief that comes from being misunderstood, or overlooked, or dismissed. The air tightened again. Sandra turned to her. Are we still talking about my film? She asked gently. Maybe, Whoopi replied. Joy cleared her throat. Well, Sandra, you mentioned earlier that certain perspectives get praised more easily than others. Do you feel that affected your approach to the movie? Sandra hesitated. It wasn't the question she wanted, but she recognized the lifeline Joy was offering. An opportunity to steer the moment back to safer territory. I think, Sandra said, that storytelling should never depend on who's allowed to tell it. And I think there's still a long way to go before that happens. Whoopi let out a soft, almost imperceptible scoff. Sandra heard it. The audience heard it. And suddenly, the thread holding the moment together snapped. Sandra turned fully toward Whoopi. If you disagree with what I said, just say it. Whoopi didn't hesitate. I disagree with how you said it. Sunny's hand flew to her mouth. Sandra blinked, confusion pulling at her features. Whoopi, I was talking about systemic issues, not individuals. But you didn't say that, Whoopi countered sharply. And when you leave space for interpretation, people fill it. Especially when those people feel unheard. Sandra's jaw tightened. Are you saying I made people feel unheard? I'm saying, Whoopi said, her voice rising just slightly, that your comments came off as if certain stories only matter when the right people tell them. That is not. And when someone who has the power, influence, and privilege to tell any story you want, Say that it stings. Sandra's eyes flickered. Hurt, frustration, disbelief all swirling into something sharper. Joy stepped in again, carefully. Maybe this is something that needs more context. Sandra shook her head. No. Whoopi wants to talk about it. So let's talk. The audience leaned in, completely hooked. Her voice was measured, but beneath it lay a tremor of emotion. Whoopi, I have never said that stories only matter when I tell them. I've spent my entire career trying to amplify voices that don't get enough attention. And that's great, Whoopi replied. But sometimes advocacy can come off as performance if you're not careful. Sandra froze. Performance. Whoopi held her gaze, unwavering. Yes, performance. A wave of tension rippled across the audience. Someone whispered, wow. Someone else shook their head in disbelief. Even Sunny's pen slipped from her hand and clattered onto the table. Sandra's breath hitched. It was subtle, but noticeable enough that the cameras captured the moment her composure faltered. I don't do this for performance, Sandra said quietly. I do it because I care. I don't doubt that, Whoopi said. But caring doesn't excuse miscommunication. Sandra looked down at her hands, then back up, her eyes shimmering with something she refused to let fall. Miscommunication happens when people assume the worst. And it happens, Whoopi answered, when people aren't careful with their words. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Sandra leaned in, voice low, raw, almost trembling. Do you think I don't understand struggle? Do you really think that? After everything I've shared about my life, my family, my losses, the things I've gone through privately while cameras insisted I smile. The studio fell silent. Even the hum of the lights felt louder. Whoopi paused, and for the first time, she seemed genuinely taken aback by Sandra's vulnerability. It's not about struggle, Whoopi said softly. It's about perspective. And sometimes, Sandra, sometimes you talk about the industry like you're outside it. Sandra's eyes widened. I never said that. Ever. But that's how it sounded, Whoopi insisted. Sandra exhaled sharply. Why do we keep circling back to how it sounded instead of what I meant? Sunny finally stepped forward verbally. Maybe because intention and impact aren't always the same, she said gently. And sometimes people feel things you didn't expect. Sandra nodded slowly, letting the words settle. I understand that. Truly. Her voice quivered. But I also think it's unfair to assume I was dismissing anyone's work. Least of all yours. Whoopi's expression shifted. Just a flicker, but enough. A softening. A recognition that maybe this confrontation had spiraled further than she intended. But the conversation wasn't over. I respect you, Sandra said, voice trembling. And I think you know that. So it hurts that you'd think my advocacy is performative. Whoopi inhaled deeply. Sandra, I know you're trying to do good. I do. But there's a difference between naming a problem and understanding the weight of that problem. Sandra's eyes glistened. And you think I don't understand any of it? Whoopi hesitated. And that hesitation said everything. The audience felt it. Sandra felt it. The air tightened once more, like a fist closing around the room. Sandra shook her head slowly. You don't know what I've lived through, she whispered. What I've survived. Then tell us, Whoopi replied softly. The request wasn't a challenge. It wasn't a trap. It was an opening, a human one. An invitation Sandra didn't expect, and wasn't entirely sure she wanted. But she took it. My mother, Sandra began, her voice quiet but steady, passed away years before I was ready to lose her. And I had to grieve her while promoting movies. Smiling for cameras. Pretending everything was fine. The studio held its breath. I adopted my son in the middle of a media storm, she continued, her voice cracking. And I was terrified. Terrified of doing it wrong. Terrified of the world judging me. Terrified of all the ways I'd already failed before even beginning. A tear escaped her eye. She wiped it quickly. And then losing Brian, she whispered, referring to her longtime partner. The pain in her voice echoed through the room like a pulse. I had to carry that grief quietly, privately, while the world expected me to stay strong. Sunny's eyes welled. Joy looked down. Even Whoopi's posture softened, her expression shifting from challenge to empathy. That's why I made this film, Sandra said. Not to perform, not to preach, but because my grief, was swallowing me whole. And I needed to turn it into something that meant something. A heavy silence filled the room. Whoopi's voice softened. Sandra, I didn't know. I know, Sandra whispered, because I didn't talk about it. A long pause stretched between them, the air thick with realization. Whoopi looked down at the table, then back up with a gentler expression. I wasn't trying to attack you. I just wanted clarity. Sandra nodded, tears glistening. And I wanted understanding. The tension didn't disappear, but it shifted, softened, reshaped itself into something complicated and human. But just as the moment began to settle, a new tension rose. The audience started murmuring, not loudly, but audibly enough that the hosts took notice. Something was happening in the atmosphere, in the invisible space between respect, injury, and reconciliation. Whoopi cleared her throat, ready to respond. But before she could, the floor manager held up the dreaded signal. Wrap it up. The timing landed like a gut punch. Whoopi sighed, frustration flickering across her expression. Sandra looked away, blinking hard, still fighting to keep her composure. Sunny leaned toward the camera. We'll be right back. The screen faded to black again. But this time, the silence wasn't tense. It was emotional. It was heavy. It was the kind of silence that precedes something even bigger. Something that hadn't happened yet, but would. And when it did, it would change everything. The moment the screen faded to black, the studio felt like it had been plunged underwater. Quiet, heavy, thick with unspoken words that clung to the air like humidity. The audience sat frozen in their seats, whispering but not daring to fully exhale. They could sense that something unfinished, something boiling, was still simmering between Sandra and Whoopi. Something the cameras had barely begun to capture. The producers huddled behind the set, heads bent over a tablet showing live social media comments flooding in by the second. Clips from the earlier exchange had already been posted, dissected, magnified. Twitter, always merciless, was crackling with hot takes that neither woman had time to process yet. If only they knew the moment was still far from over. The makeup artist returned to Sandra with a cotton pad, but even she looked hesitant this time. Her hands didn't just tremble, they hovered. Sandra gave her a small, reassuring smile. It's okay. I'm fine. But she wasn't. Not really. Her chest felt tight, her pulse pounding with that slow, suffocating rhythm that comes after a public emotional reveal. She had never planned to share the deepest fractures of her life on national television. But Whoopi's challenge had cracked something open inside her. And now the exposed vulnerability was raw and throbbing. Whoopi sat quietly, staring at her hands. She wasn't proud of how the conversation had unfolded. She had meant to push for clarity, not provoke an unraveling. But the line between truth-seeking and confrontation is razor-thin, and she had crossed it without realizing how deep Sandra's pain ran beneath her polished composure. Sunny leaned closer to Whoopi. Are you okay? She whispered. Whoopi exhaled slowly. I didn't mean to hurt her. You didn't hurt her, Sunny murmured. You just hit something tender. Whoopi nodded faintly, though she wasn't sure whether that eased her conscience or deepened it. Across the table, Joy watched the two silently, her fingers tapped nervously against her coffee mug. Sarah was still staring at her lap, trying to process everything at once. This wasn't just another heated view moment. This was something deeper, more human, more fragile. 30 seconds, the floor manager called. Sandra straightened in her seat. Her breathing steadied. She wiped the last remnants of tears from beneath her eyes and forced a soft, neutral expression. She had been in the industry long enough to know that the show must always go on, even if her heart hadn't caught up. Whoopi turned slightly toward her. Sandra, she whispered, just loud enough for her to hear. If you need a moment, we can. Sandra shook her head quickly. No. If I stop now, I won't be able to start again. Whoopi swallowed. The guilt tightened in her throat. Sunny looked between them, unsure whether to step in or stay back. 10 seconds. The lights brightened. The audience straightened up. The air shifted again. This time not with confrontation, but anticipation. Something was coming. They all felt it. The cameras blinked back to life. Whoopi regained her composure. Welcome back to The View. But her voice was different now. Softer. Lower. No longer sharp. Sandra offered the audience a polite smile. Joy tried to inject a little warmth into the moment. Sandra, thank you for being so open with us earlier. I know that wasn't easy. Sandra nodded gently. Thank you, Joy. The audience murmured sympathetically. Whoopi inhaled deeply, then turned towards her. Sandra, I want you to know, I didn't expect you to share all that. And I'm sorry if my questions pushed you somewhere painful. The apology wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't polished. It was rough, honest, delivered with a humility that only Whoopi could convey. Sandra met her eyes. The tension had softened, but it hadn't vanished. It lingered with a delicate uncertainty. It's okay, Sandra said quietly. Sometimes pain needs a push to come out, even if the push isn't gentle. The audience reacted with soft, emotional sighs. A few people dabbed their eyes. But even with the tension easing, the conversation had opened a door that couldn't be closed. Not yet. Sunny leaned forward, gently steering the direction. Sandra, earlier you talked about vulnerability in storytelling, and you've shown a lot of vulnerability today. Do you think Hollywood allows women, especially high-profile women, to be vulnerable publicly? Sandra's eyes flickered with thought. Her voice was calm, but layered with meaning. Hollywood likes vulnerability when it fits neatly into a narrative. When it's packaged, marketable. But when it's raw, like grief, like fear, like doubt, people don't know what to do with it. They either sensationalize it or look away. Do you think that's why you hesitated to share before? Sarah asked softly. Sandra nodded. Yes, because when you're a woman in this industry, if you crack, even for a second, people don't see it as human. They see it as weak, or dramatic, or manipulative. Whoopi shifted in her seat. But what you did today wasn't weak, Sandra. It was real. Sandra's eyes glistened again, not from sadness but gratitude. Unexpected gratitude. Thank you, she said quietly. The audience applauded softly, supportively, respectfully. But then, the energy shifted again. A different producer approached the edge of the set, motioning urgently. Something was happening backstage. Something the hosts weren't yet aware of. The floor manager's eyes widened. He held up a different sign than before. Breaking news segment in 2 minutes. Joy groaned softly, under her breath. Of course, today of all days. But the disruption didn't just irritate. It disrupted the emotional arc that had finally begun to settle. Sandra felt her nerves spike again as she sensed another storm forming. Sunny cleared her throat. Before we move on, there's something else I wanted to ask you, Sandra. About your earlier comment. Sandra nodded, bracing herself. Sunny spoke gently. When you talked about certain stories being elevated depending on who tells them, did you feel that with this film? Sandra took a moment. A long moment. Then she nodded. Yes. Whoopi's expression tightened, not confrontational but curious. How? She asked. Sandra inhaled slowly. When we were pitching the film, I had a close friend, a woman of color, who'd been trying to get a similar story made for years. She faced rejection after rejection. But when I brought my version forward, studios were suddenly interested. The audience murmured. Sandra continued, her voice laced with guilt. I felt awful, because the difference wasn't the story. It was me. The room fell into a stunned hush. And that, Sandra said, is the problem I was talking about. Whoopi leaned forward, her expression softer now, more open. Okay, that makes sense. That's clarity. Sandra nodded. I should have said it that clearly the first time. I didn't. And that's on me. Whoopi's lips curved into the faintest smile. Thank you for saying it now. The audience applauded, louder this time, not for drama, but for resolution. But resolution didn't mean calm. Not yet, because the next moment, unexpected, spontaneous, would send the room into another emotional spiral. A woman in the audience suddenly stood up. Everyone turned. Sandra froze slightly, startled. The woman's voice trembled. Sandra, thank you for speaking about grief. I lost my daughter last year, and hearing someone like you say you've struggled too, it means more than you know. Sandra's breath caught. Tears filled her eyes instantly. The entire studio murmured in a wave of empathy. Sandra rose from her seat, breaking the protocol of the show, walking toward the edge of the stage. The cameras followed her instinctively. The audience watched in breathless silence. Sandra reached out her hand toward the woman. I'm so sorry for your loss, she whispered. The woman covered her mouth with her hands, crying softly. For a moment, just a moment, the show became something entirely different. Not entertainment, not debate, connection, human and fragile. Sandra squeezed the woman's hand before stepping back, emotion overwhelming her. She returned to her seat slowly, wiping tears from her cheeks. Whoopi watched her with a softened, almost maternal expression. A subtle nod acknowledged everything Sandra had just done. But fate wasn't done with them, because as Sandra sat, still trembling, the soundstage speakers crackled. The producer signaled frantically. Whoopi glanced at the teleprompter and stiffened. We have some developing news coming in. Joy swallowed. Oh boy. Sandra blinked, confused. Sunny leaned toward the camera. We're getting reports that the clip from earlier, Sandra's emotional moment, has gone viral. It's trending worldwide. The audience gasped. Sandra's mouth parted, shocked. Already? It's everywhere, Sarah added softly. People are reacting strongly. Whoopi looked at Sandra gently. We should talk about that. Sandra nodded slowly, trying to reassemble her composure. Yeah, okay. The moment threatened to swallow her whole, but she didn't run from it. Not anymore. Whoopi spoke quietly, with measured sincerity. The world is seeing a version of you they've never seen before. Raw, honest, vulnerable. Sandra's voice cracked. That scares me. I know, Whoopi said. But sometimes the truth scares people first and heals them after. Sandra stared at her, absorbing the unexpectedly gentle wisdom. Then the floor manager signaled again. One more segment, then closing. Sandra exhaled deeply. She wasn't ready, but she had no choice. And in the next segment, when emotions would collide once more, when the world outside the studio began reacting in real time, when the fragile peace between Sandra and Whoopi would face its ultimate test, the moment would become something none of them could ever forget. The studio was no longer a studio. It was a pressure chamber, every breath heavy, every moment swollen with the aftermath of what had just erupted on live television. Nobody moved at first. The lights hummed overhead, the cameras stayed perfectly still, and the audience existed in a state between disbelief and slow-building adrenaline, as though reality itself needed a second to catch up to what it had just witnessed. Sandra Bullock stood with her hands braced against the edge of the table, her breath shallow, her pulse visibly pounding at her neck. Whoopi Goldberg had not sat back down. She remained standing as well, her body tense but composed, her expression unreadable. Two women, two legacies, two careers shaped by decades of pressure, expectation, and public scrutiny, brought to a boiling point without warning. The director's voice crackled loudly through the overhead system. We're still live. We're still live. Someone needs, just keep it together. But nothing could be contained now. A single voice from the crowd broke the silence. Oh my God, another whispered. They're really fighting. Then the room erupted into that chaotic mixture of stunned gasps, half-whispers, and nervous reactions that only comes when an audience realizes it has just witnessed something that will become a permanent part of television history. People grabbed their phones. Screens lit up. Fingers began tapping, recording, texting, tweeting. The world outside the studio was already being pulled into the storm. Sandra finally spoke first. Her voice was softer now, but still trembling from the emotional blow she'd just taken. Whoopi, I didn't come here to be humiliated. I came here to talk about something I put my heart into. And you turned it into something else. Whoopi inhaled slowly, not defensive now, not confrontational, but deeply exhausted. Sandra, I didn't try to humiliate you. I've done this job a long time. I've asked tough questions for a long time. That's what we do here. That's the show. But it wasn't a tough question, Sandra said, her voice gaining strength. It was a cut. You know the difference. After all these years, you know exactly where that line is. A murmur pulsed through the crowd, agreement from some, discomfort from others. Whoopi's jaw tightened, then released. Maybe I crossed it. Maybe I did. But you, she hesitated, her voice heavy with the weight of every unspoken moment of professional tension she had previously concealed. You came in defensive. You came in guarded from the moment you sat down. Sandra's eyes widened. Of course I was guarded. Do you have any idea what it's like to carry a story like this for years? Do you have any idea what it feels like to finally be ready to open up, only for someone to throw the hardest part of your past back at you in front of millions? A few audience members clapped reflexively, not as applause, but as an emotional release. The tension was so sharp it almost demanded it. Sunny Hostin, seated quietly until now, stood up slowly, like a mediator stepping into the center of a battlefield. Ladies, she said gently, everyone here respects both of you, but we need to stop before this becomes something none of us can repair. But the damage was already rippling outwards. Production assistants paced frantically behind the cameras, hands on headsets, eyes darting toward the control room. Executives were already texting each other. PR teams were bracing for impact. Every second that passed was another frame of live television that would be replayed, dissected, and argued about for days, maybe weeks. Sandra's breathing slowed. Her eyes drifted away from Whoopi, away from Sunny, away from the cameras. She looked toward the audience. And there, she saw something she hadn't expected, empathy. Not judgment, not ridicule, but honest human empathy. It steadied her. She straightened up, rolled her shoulders back, and spoke into the room, not just to the studio audience, but to the millions watching at home. I didn't want this moment, she said. I didn't want conflict. I only wanted honesty. Maybe this, maybe all of this, is what honesty looks like sometimes. The audience fell silent again, but this time from emotional weight, not shock. Whoopi watched her carefully. Her voice, when she finally found it, was lower than before, stripped of the earlier fire. Sandra, listen. You've been through things most people don't know. I was trying to do my job, but maybe I forgot that sometimes the person across from me isn't just a guest. Sometimes they're carrying something fragile. The two women held each other's gaze for a long, stretched-out moment, one that could have broken again or healed at last. The studio felt suspended in that possibility. Then Whoopi exhaled and looked at the floor as if disarming herself. I shouldn't have asked it like that, she admitted. And I'm sorry for that. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was simple, real, heavy with truth. Sandra's lips parted, the anger inside her untangling just enough to allow a flicker of understanding. I appreciate that, she said softly. I do. A few people in the audience nodded, as though they had witnessed something rare. Two strong women choosing something other than ego, something other than escalation. But even as the tension softened, the damage had already etched itself into the show. The director shouted, 30 seconds. Close it out. Close it out. Sunny stepped forward quickly, taking control of the moment the way only a seasoned anchor could. We want to thank Sandra Bullock for being here, she said, her tone gentle but firm, as if wrapping the entire confrontation in a protective shell. We appreciate her honesty, her vulnerability, and her willingness to speak openly, especially when things get difficult. Whoopi added, Yeah, thank you, Sandra. Sandra nodded once. Not a smile. Not forgiveness. Just acknowledgement. Enough to bring the moment to a close without pretending everything was fine. And then, finally, the live broadcast cut to commercial. The second the on-air light flicked off, the studio exploded into movement. Staff rushed in. Microphones were unclipped. Producers whispered urgently into headsets. The audience immediately began buzzing like a hive struck by thunder. Did you record it? I can't believe that happened. She snapped at Whoopi. On live TV. It's already trending. Phones were up everywhere. Clips were already uploaded. Screenshots already circulating. Within minutes, hashtags formed, some defending Sandra, others defending Whoopi, many simply reveling in the spectacle. Outside the studio, satellite trucks beamed the moment to every entertainment network in the country. Websites scrambled to publish articles. Commentators prepared hot takes. Podcasts scheduled emergency episodes. The View had produced one of the most explosive segments in its history without ever planning to. Sandra slipped out through the back hallway, surrounded by her team. Her face was pale, her hands trembling, not out of anger now, but from the sheer emotional crash after such a confrontation. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence said everything. Whoopi remained behind for a moment, alone at the table, staring at the empty chair where Sandra had sat. She rubbed her temples, exhaled, and whispered to herself, Well, that's going to follow me for a while. And she was right. By the time evening rolled around, the internet had split into factions. Comment sections overflowed. Fan groups clashed. News anchors paused mid-broadcast to replay the confrontation. People analyzed Sandra's tone, Whoopi's expression, Sunny's intervention. Every second of footage became a meme or a point of debate. Some viewers called it one of the rawest, most unfiltered moments ever shown on daytime TV. Others insisted the show should have stepped in earlier. But everyone agreed on one thing. No one would forget what happened. Back at home, Sandra sat quietly in her living room, scrolling through the whirlwind of reactions. Some messages supported her. Others criticized her. But the truth was simpler than any spin or headline. The moment had been real, unpolished, and impossible to contain. And somewhere else, Whoopi watched the same storm unfold, her expression unreadable, the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. No matter how the narrative twisted, no matter how social media distorted it, one fact remained. The world had witnessed something undeniably human. Two powerful women clashing beneath the brightest spotlight imaginable, revealing the pressure, the pain, and the vulnerability that fame tries endlessly to hide. And now it was your turn. Because moments like these don't just belong to the celebrities involved. They belong to the audience who watches, who interprets, who feels every rise and fall of the tension. So now I turn it over to you. What did you think about the confrontation between Sandra Bullock and Whoopi Goldberg? Whose side were you on? Do you think things went too far? Or was it the most honest moment The View has had in years? Let your voice be heard. Comment your thoughts below. And if you want more dramatic, cinematic deep dives into the most unforgettable celebrity moments, make sure you hit that subscribe button for Stage View, turn on notifications, and join us for the next explosive story. Because on this channel, the drama never sleeps.